Irish Nation, welcome to the show. It's another bye week for Notre Dame football and another successful week of chaos. 7 top 25 teams lose. Notre Dame now, I think, pretty squarely inside track that if ND wins out, we are back in the conversation for a home game. Could maybe lose to USC to end the year in 10-2, still get in. Let's not plan on that. Mike, let's go run the table. How's your bye week, man?
It was great. I think there's nothing more therapeutic as a college football fan than generally sitting in a pretty good position, having a bye week, and then just watching the rest of college football and just praying for chaos. And it wasn't quite as crazy as the Notre Dame's first bye week, which was a historically crazy, chaotic bye week. But this one still, Brett, as you mentioned, it's seven. I think you said 7 top 25 teams went down. That's a lot. And I think fortunately a number of these were favorable to Notre Dame. So yeah, I mean, Kansas State went down, Iowa State went down, Clemson. That was a big one for us because Louisville were the ones who beat Clemson. So you kind of get the benefit of Clemson getting knocked down a peg and then our Louisville win looking better. Unfortunately, Texas A&M lost, which makes our win against them obviously not look as good. But then it also kind of takes them out of the picture in terms of likelihood to grab spots. So that offsets it a little bit. But yeah, it was fun just watching.
And I think the committee is going to see Connor Wegman didn't play in that game, had a backup quarterback. Clearly, that was not the same Texas A&M team that, by the way, still has a chance to play their way into an SEC championship. So I think the jury is hopefully still out on A&M. But agreed, at this point, our schedule is what it is. 11-1 gets us in, 10-2 maybe does. I think this is less shopping our schedule. This is more go win and hope other teams lose. You mentioned some of those games. I thought for ND fans that this hasn't been covered as well as I thought it would be. So I'll at least say my take on it. This ultimately comes down to how many teams get in from each conference and kind of how many spots are vying around, right? So it's very clear the SEC is trending towards probably 4 teams. Right now, that would be Bama, Tennessee, Texas, Georgia. Big Ten also in the mix for 4 teams. What really stood out this week is, will the Big 12 be a multi-team league? And with Kansas State and Iowa State losing, and as weak as the undefeated BYU schedule is, if BYU runs the table, I think the others will be knocked out as 2-loss teams. I think if one of those teams beat BYU in the championship, I also think BYU at 11-1 without really a lot of marquee wins to their name, like not a great resume. So Big 12, big time implosion there. Same in the ACC. Now you have a 2-loss Clemson team, a 1-loss SMU team, and a 1-loss Pittsburgh team. And SMU and Pittsburgh have really weak strength of schedules. So does Miami. If Miami runs the table, the ACC is a 1-conference team. A 1-team conference. And so I think that kind of beating up within the conferences, going from maybe 2 teams to 1 team for 2 of those top 4 conferences, at most now they're going to be getting 2 teams each, just opens up more spots, opens up more possibilities for Notre Dame, including putting us back in position for a home game.
Definitely. I think, as we touched on it, at this point, if you're looking at probability trees of teams that can get into the playoff, you're just hoping that each weekend, a number of those just get crossed off. And that's, Brett, you outlined a bunch of them. I mentioned a few. That's exactly what happened here. Obviously, on top of that, you'd like to see some of your wins, some of the teams that you beat, also continue to do well and build their strength of schedule. But I do think at this point, it is one of the most critical things that could happen is just potential contenders just get knocked out. Even if it's something not super likely, even if, say, they had like a 10% chance of getting in, if you can just eliminate that, every little bit helps and just makes it more and more certain that Notre Dame will be able to not only get in, and Brett, I'm with you. I think if we went out, we're in. It's more of a question of whether or not we get a home playoff game in that situation.
Totally.
But there are some scenarios where if we lose to USC, maybe we could still sneak in. I think our goal needs to definitely be to just win out. But as you knock out these other scenarios, I think it makes some of these upside scenarios at 10-2 a bit more likely.
People want to talk about ND's best win. Look, Louisville looked real. Texas A&M with a backup quarterback hung in there, but clearly playing well in the SEC. It's important to note other people have that too. It's really easy to focus on your resume as a problem. Indiana's going to go and play Ohio State in 2 weeks in the big house and be underdogs. Maybe they pull that off. Statistically, SP Plus loves Indiana. This is not a fluke IU team that's scraping by. Like, statistically, they are dominant, but they have yet to play a team with a record better than 5-4. That is shocking. They've yet to play a team with a record better than 5-4. Probably their best win is Washington, a 5-4 team. Maybe you could argue it's Nebraska, also at 5-4, and they dominated. They beat Nebraska 56-7. Like, tip your hat. That's a great win. But they've got Michigan, Ohio State coming up. Probably their two, toughest tests yet, especially Ohio State. Tennessee still has to go play at Georgia and at Vandy. We mentioned BYU, easier track to get to the Big 12 title game, but they still got that. So, like, a lot of the teams around us still have some carnage in front of them, and I think keeps opening the door for us. But maybe enough on the field. We can keep tracking that here as I think we go. 4 weeks left. It's a win out, you're in situation. So, two things on today's agenda. Florida State preview. What was supposed to be in the preseason, we said we were arguing if this was our second or third toughest game. That is, of course, not the case with the 1-8 Seminoles coming to town. And then we did a deep dive on analytics that came out of the broadcast booth during the Navy game, talking about citing Notre Dame as one of the best fourth down efficiency teams in the country. Spoiler alert, we're not number one. We're not quite sure where the broadcast came up with that one, but we are pretty darn good. And there's real evidence that Marcus Freeman is getting more and more aggressive in fourth down. We dug into the numbers, got a fun section there on kind of the math behind when to go for, when not to go forward. And we'll cover that after the preview. So, Mike, let's jump in. I'll go through maybe some of the stats in a little bit here on what happened to Florida State. I'll maybe cover the numbers, but in the playoff a year ago, an undefeated regular season, they were a top 10 team in SP Plus. Now they're 69th in SP Plus. They're 1-8. They've lost 5 in a row. Like, they're getting blown out left, right, and sideways. And some of that's the good teams. Miami, SMU, Clemson, like, that's a tough schedule. But getting blown out by UNC, that's a really average ACC team. Massive issues in Florida State. How'd they get here?
Well, it's interesting because when we previewed Florida State at the beginning of the year, we didn't predict that they were going to have a dramatic drop-off, but we did actually call out that there were scenarios where this could happen. So it's interesting. You look at their roster, they're 57th in returning starters, which is pretty similar to ND. But what's critical here is who they lost. And we did call this out at the beginning of the season. So 10 NFL draft picks, 22 transfers out. So that's over a third of the roster. We mentioned last year they were very successful in the transfer portal. Many of their marquee transfer portal pickups last year turned out to be home runs. And so I think a short answer here is that just hasn't happened this year. A lot of their transfer portal pickups just haven't been as effective. Some of the players that ended up leaving the program were not exactly great losses. Some of their, they've lost some key depth there. I think everyone in the media, a big theme has been how this is the new college football. Mike Norvell is the best at it. They'll reload and be a top 10 team with all the transfers that they brought in. That was certainly the narrative at the time. And I think given that Mike Norvell had done that a year before, we were willing to give him a little bit of, a little bit of credit. We were willing to believe that narrative a bit. We acknowledge that. But I think a key theme for us was that there was uncertainty and there was risk. So I'm going to read. We went back. We pulled a quote from the preview that we did at the beginning of the year. But here's something that we said at the time at the beginning of the year. I don't want to doubt Norvell too much, as I believe he's a good coach and has proven an ability to excel leaning on the transfer portal. But this team seems to have a lot of uncertainty. I doubt they can recapture the magic that they had last year again. So that's what we said at the time. So we were willing to give Norvell a little credit, but we were a bit cautious in our approach. We said that we thought they might be the second or third hardest game on ND's schedule, though. So it's not like we were. If we were in Vegas, we would. Brett and I certainly weren't putting money on the fact that Florida State was going to collapse, but we did flag some of these issues at the time. So again, this isn't. Interestingly, this isn't about injuries. It's just that they're really not that good. It's just their pickups haven't been great. The depth that they've lost has impacted them. They just have simply not been able to reload to the extent that we thought that they would be able to. And Brett, you and I were talking about this right before we started recording, but you pulled some data on, I guess, how historic a drop-off this was. So I'm going to kick it over to you if you want to put that into context a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically what I went and did is I looked at every single team back to 1986, so almost 40 years of data. How big of a drop off did they go in the efficiency metric? So obviously, going from an undefeated regular season to 1-8 is astonishing. But play by play data, how bad did they get? And last year they were number ninth. This year they're, I think I maybe said 69 earlier. They're 71st this year. So they've had a 62 drop off in the ranking. That, if you translate that to the efficiency rating behind it, isn't historically out of this world. Um, but it is for a top 10 team. So over the last 40 years, there's about 110 teams that have had a drop off as big as them. So two or three teams a year will drop off this much. But for teams that were at a top 10 caliber, there's only 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. I should have counted them before the show. There's only 11. And even in there, there's a bunch of like historic, oh, yeah, that makes sense. LSU, after graduating Joe Burrow and Justin Jefferson and Lamar Chase, like all those guys that were like so critical to that championship during COVID. And then everyone kind of knows about the Coach O demise at LSU. Year one to year two of Willie Taggart, sort of losing the Jimbo Fisher era recruiting, and just then what happened with Willie Taggart imploding that program. Everyone knows, yep, that program was spiraling and could see it coming. Miami, Ohio was an interesting one in 2004, had Ben Roethlisberger in 2003, and were a legit top 10 team out of the MAC. They finished 10th in the AP poll, were a very solid team. The advanced metrics loved them. They lose Ben Roethlisberger, and they go back to being Miami, Ohio. And so, a lot of those make sense, but really you only see this big of a drop off of a top 10 team just completely imploding like this once every 3 or 4 years. And right now, Florida State's on the short end of that stick. And you could argue this is like about injuries or, something like just losing close games. So DJU probably missing the season. He had surgery on his hand. It felt like he was going to get benched anyways. And so now they've gone to Brock Glenn at quarterback. I'm curious, Mike, your thoughts on him. We know DJU well. He's 0-2 at Notre Dame Stadium, playing for the injured Trevor Lawrence in 2020 for Clemson, and then again in 2022, two massive wins in the Notre Dame era here recently in the last 5 years over Dabo and Clemson. So we know DJU. He was really struggling though in Florida State. Goes down with an injury, probably out for the year. They've turned it over to Glenn here. I'm curious your thoughts on the quarterback situation.
I think poor QB play has been a big theme for Florida State this year. DJU was a key part of that up until his injury. And I don't think it's really going to get much better. I don't think Glenn is a silver bullet. I think some Florida State fans have talked up him as a potential QB of the future. But if you dive in, Brett, I think you made a comment. He's more the Florida State, or at least you made a comment to me off the air. He's more of the Florida State version of Tom Rees, which doesn't mean that he can't be a solid player, but he's more of a 3-star developmental prospect, not necessarily like a 5-star future NFL starter, like like a Trevor Lawrence or someone like that. So I don't think it's certainly not going to get much better this year. He's got 4 touchdowns, 3 interceptions in his last 3 starts. He hasn't topped 125 passing yards. And then he actually got benched against Miami for the 3rd stringer. So look, I don't think it's I don't think there's like a whole lot of hope for Florida State in terms of a dramatic improvement in their QB play.
The one area that has held together better is their defense. The SP Plus has them as the 36th most efficient defense. And I think that side of the ball could probably even be better if not left out to dry so often by the offense. It feels like they've been put in a really bad position. Like, when your offense goes 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out, it's hard for defense to hold up. That being said, the rest of their advanced metrics really struggle. So this is a great example where the SP Plus is the one metric that we love talking about because it adjusts for opponent. So they've gone up against Heisman contender Cam Ward in Miami. They've gone up against SMU that is, at least right now, a pretty darn prolific offense. Even Clemson is statistically a pretty good offense. UNC, pretty good offense. Georgia Tech, pretty good offense. Like, they've played a lot of top, I'm not going to say top 5 offenses, but top 25, top 30, top 40 type offenses. And it's showing where, they've hung in there, and that's why SP Plus likes them. But on pretty much all the other metrics we talk about, they rank 81st in success rate allowed. They are 80th in line yards allowed. So how much push is an offense generating? They are 113th in generating havoc. In fact, they have just 2 interceptions on the year and 1 fumble recovered. Just 3 forced turnovers 9 games into the season. Their explosiveness metrics are 101st in the country. Like, teams just have success against them. And those are pretty good offenses, but Notre Dame has a pretty good offense. So, yes, the defensive side of the ball is better than the offense. I think the offense just behind the quarterback play is just a train wreck right now. And I hate to dunk on a team, but I mean, when you're 1-8, it's hard to find a silver lining. It's maybe their defense is playing well considering the strength of schedule and the offenses they've gone up against. But sort of like they're not doing well against those defenses either. Mike, is there a big name on offense or defense that if you're going to say, okay, look, statistically as a group, they're not doing well, but here's the big 1 or 2 players that if they piece it together, if they really go, have the breakout, you could see this being competitive, or you could see it at least being interesting. Like who's the 1 or 2 players we should be talking about?
I think the fact that I am going to highlight a safety, I think that tells you a lot about their defense. So Shaheem Brown, hopefully I said that correctly, but yeah, he's their leading tackler, and that's their safety. So that's usually not a good sign. That usually means that offensive players are getting to the second level, and then you're requiring the safety to come in and basically save the day. Ideally, you'd like to see a linebacker leading the team in tackles. That's I would say that's a more common thing. On the defensive line, there's not really a name to highlight here, but they have 5 different players who have 3+ sacks. So coming into this year, a point for their defensive line was that they're supposed to have depth and rotation. So I think that's true here. I think those would be the areas that I highlight. But yeah, Brett, I would say their defense is it is the better side of the ball for sure, no question. Their offense has been absolutely abysmal. And then you highlight, I think a lot of it is like you mentioned these stats, they don't look great, but then I think the context that they have played a lot of top offenses. That's the key thing that you got to bear in mind. Like they're the number 1 offense. SMU and Clemson, they're both around top 10. So yeah, they've played some very tough offenses, really good offenses. And then as you mentioned, the Florida State offense isn't doing them any favors. So I think I think the fact that I can't just point to one guy on defense and say this guy is an absolute stud. This person is this person is going to be like a 1st round pick in the NFL draft. I think that tells you that even though this is the side of the ball that's doing a bit better, even though that they've like held up maybe a bit better than maybe you would have thought against some of the top offenses, they're still not excelling. They're really, I think given where they were last year, I think this is still been a disappointing performance for them on that side of the ball.
So before we get to score predictions and betting lines and where we think this goes, if there's one place where you could see Florida State pulling off an upset here, it's that you don't play a lot of 1-8 teams that are also top 15 in the 24/7 talent composite. This roster is still loaded with 4 stars. They might not be gelling. They might not be playing well together. It might be a lot of the guys that, frankly, got passed up for starting roles before, but, couldn't transfer elsewhere. And so they stuck around. Like there's kind of a lot of that we're seeing on kind of the Florida State beat writers of there's 4 stars, but it's kind of the guys that couldn't go to the NFL. And it's just weird, or a lot of underclassmen and not a lot of upperclassmen of 4 stars, but still it's a talented roster. It's just hard to think you're 1-8. It's actually supposed to be pretty nice weather. I saw the high 60 degrees and sunny next weekend. So, this isn't like a cold November South Bend game, but it just feels like this roster is packed it in and are in a deflated place. And regardless of what the talent says on the recruiting sheet, every other metric is just like, there's not a mismatch anywhere. Maybe I was really stretching here. There's one advanced stat where they rank top 20 in the explosive index. That is not specifically to passing plays. And that's not to say they're top 20 in number of passing plays, but the relative portion of their offense skews towards big passing plays. Now, I think that's reflective of the fact that There's not a lot else working in their offense, but they've had some success in kind of a deeper passing attack and getting things open downfield. And look, I think Indy's responded very well to the Ben Morrison injury, but you're still without Ben Morrison. That's worth noting. Maybe that's a mismatch. Maybe. But Notre Dame's also number one in pass success rate allowed as a team. It's just hard to say that's a mismatch. And everywhere else, Florida State's stunk. So, Mike, let's jump into score predictions. I've got the early Vegas lines. I haven't seen something formally published as of time of recording, but I saw FanDuel and DraftKings were floating 21.5 to 23.5. The SP Plus rating implies Notre Dame should be about a 28 to 29 point favorite. So SP Plus likes Notre Dame more than Vegas does. That being said, whenever you get into these really big spreads, Vegas also kind of assumes that the end of the game is garbage time and people are running out the clock, and so, usually pulls the line down from what SP Plus says. ESPN has Notre Dame winning this one 96.5% of the time, according to their win predictor. So Notre Dame, big time favorites here to start the November slate. Mike, what are you expecting for this one?
I think no matter where you cut it, it's a massive mismatch. We just are head and shoulders above them in every aspect. What it really comes down to is, are we going to show up? Are we going to play our best game against Florida State? And obviously against there have been certain games in the past where we haven't, where we will inexplicably have a bad performance. I don't think this will be one of those games. I think we had a bye week. We saw a bunch of chaos happen. Marcus Freeman, I'm sure, is going to be bringing that up to his team as we prepare for Florida State. He'll be pointing out the teams that lost. He'll certainly show footage of the NIU game, which he's been doing over and over again this year. So I think we'll be well rested. I think another bye week to just get the offense even more in sync, which we've already been seeing improvement. I think that's going to help. I think these other factors you mentioned with Florida State, right? They're 1-8. They can't qualify for a bowl. They got to go all the way to South Bend. I guess it's not going to be cold, but this time of the year, the weather can change pretty rapidly. So we'll see what the temperature ends up being at kickoff. But I think you stack up all these things, and it's just hard for me to imagine Florida State, I guess, like really rallying and playing, like they have actually something to play for. A lot of these guys we mentioned, they're transfers, so they're not as invested in the program. They're not as invested in the school. So I don't know. Like, look, I don't want to say that anyone's going to check out, but if there were a scenario where someone would check out, this would probably be that scenario for Florida State. So I think if we show up like we should, which I expect, I think we blow them out pretty big. And my prediction is that we beat the spread. We beat we actually beat roughly what well, let's see. Actually, I don't. I guess SP Plus. Like, I guess I don't have us necessarily beating that, but I'm predicting 40-9. Oh no, actually that is okay. Yeah, I'm predicting us. So that is beating SP Plus. So big win for Notre Dame. Beat the Vegas lines. Beat the implied SP Plus spread.
And actually, as of recording, I just looked it back up. It's now posted. I've got an official Vegas line at 24.5 points. So a little closer to the SP Plus there. I've got very similar reasons. I've got this one 38-10. And I just think Marcus Freeman is going to have this team hyper-focused because you can't lose this one. And there's an interesting divergence that there's two playoff prediction models I've been tracking. There's one on ESPN and there's one on The Athletic. The Athletic, home of Pete Sampson. If you're interested, he's one of my favorite beat writers. They have a nerds model on who gets into the playoff. ESPN has ND making the playoff now 58% of the time. And that is about our chance of winning out. So we're going to be favored to win 85 to 95% of the time in ND's 3 games leading up to USC. 96% chance in this game, 96% chance against UVA, 87% chance against Army, and about a 2/3 chance against USC. If you multiply those together, that's about a 55 to 60% chance to run the table. So what ESPN's prediction model is saying, ND has to run the table to get in or they're for sure out. The Athletics is now diverging from that and saying ND has a 90% chance to get in. And I think what that really means is if we lost to USC in the finale, 10-2 gets us in. If you lose to 1-8 Florida State, no chance. And I think Freeman and every single person in that program is probably treating this more like ESPN's model. Every game is a playoff at this point. Like they are treating this as we have to run the table or there is no more tomorrow. I think that's a great state of mind to be in, to not overlook a 1-8 team, not forget about the, hey, they might be 1-8, but they were in a playoff a year ago. Like that's got to be the message in the locker room. So I have Notre Dame locked in on this one. I think we're just the better team on both sides of the ball, win it easily. Very similar score to what you predicted. I've got it 38-10. All right, fourth down metrics. To kick things off, 2 weeks ago in the Navy game, or I guess a week ago, the ABC broadcast cited this multiple times. Notre Dame's the best in the country at fourth down efficiency. They didn't specify how they measured it. So, of course, we dug in. And I'll lead off by saying we're not number one in any of these metrics, but we are very solid in all of them, and we have shown to be very aggressive. Mike, before we get into the numbers, I'm curious, just what's your maybe more qualitative reaction on Marcus Freeman's decision making in fourth down situations this year, and also as we've seen him evolve in his 3 years as a head coach for the Irish?
I think this is a key area that he's evolved as a coach. I think there was a fear when Marcus Freeman took over. He was a defensive coach, defensive background. I think people were maybe a bit nervous that he wouldn't be as aggressive at times. Maybe he would play a bit more trestle ball, just punt, play the field position battle. And I think early on, sometimes he fell into those tendencies in his first couple of years. But I think what we've seen as he's grown as a coach, especially this year, is that he's become a lot more aggressive on fourth down. He's leaning into the metrics. So when the math says that you should go for it, he's been taking that and doing it. And I think that's been paying off for us. I think it's been a net positive. So my reaction to Marcus Freeman in these situations is that he's been improving from a coaching decision standpoint. And I think that's exactly what we want to see. I even if I just take a step back as a whole on Marcus Freeman's coaching decisions in game this year, I feel like I've had far fewer complaints than I have had in prior years. Not that I haven't had any, but I just remember even last year, I feel like there were, or his first season, I just remember many games where there could be little things that we would nitpick. And I feel like there have been far fewer of that. And look, if you're leaning into analytics, that's generally how it's gonna work. So my reaction is 2 thumbs up on the aggressiveness, 2 thumbs up on leaning into the analytics and developing as a coach from that perspective.
So where do we stack up? We pulled fourth down attempts, conversions on fourth downs, the rate of going for it on fourth down. So if all of your fourth downs, how often do you punt versus go for it? And then we also looked at what's your conversion success looking at both third and fourth down, because really that's how a lot of teams look at it now. If you got a 3rd and 6, that's not necessarily passing down anymore. Let's go get 3-4 yards to set up the 4th and short. So what's your third down plus fourth down conversion success? On number of attempts, we're 66th. Now, I think that's a little misleading because if you looked at a lot of the top teams in that stat, it's teams with not good records and not good offenses. So they just have way more fourth downs because they can't get first downs on first, second, and third down, or they're trailing in games and therefore need to be more aggressive and going for it on fourth down. So we're 66 in that category. I think that's the one I discount the most. I think there's sample size bias and just different context to the team. On converting, we're number 12 in the country. We convert 73% of our fourth downs. Huge benefit of a mobile quarterback like Riley Leonard. Average in that stat's around 55%. And we're at 73%. So that's a big, meaningful game changer. I do want to emphasize, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of, but next year, if you don't have a mobile quarterback, if you don't have that dual threat, maybe I shouldn't do it. One of the best fourth down teams in the NFL for a long time was Aaron Rodgers for the Green Bay Packers. And he ain't a mobile quarterback. And Mike McCarthy, and even in the Matt LaFleur era, would be very aggressive in fourth and short situations and use both the pass and run game very effectively. In fact, the advanced metrics tell you on fourth and short, passing the ball is actually still more effective. Even as teams have started passing it more, they're actually not utilizing that enough. It's still about 20 to 30% more effective than running the ball. I think that's a big part, though, that, when you get the mobile quarterback, you get the added threat of, okay, you can still call pass plays, you can still call run plays, but your run plays just have more versatility where a defense just can't load up and say, stop the QB sneak or stop the HB dive, or there's just more that you can do and play around with. I think it's still important to note, though, just Going for it on fourth down, whether you're good at it or bad at it, is just giving you scoring opportunities. We'll get into that a little bit more later. And the other thing I'd say is, well, do we do better on fourth down because we don't go for it as often? We're only 66th in the country and going for it. That's not really true either. I looked up the correlation between going for it on fourth down, how often do you go, versus your success rate. They're very uncorrelated, only a 12% correlation. So teams that go for it a bunch, teams that don't go for it have really similar success rates. So that also kind of breaks that fallacy. On our combined third and fourth down conversion percent, we're 28 in the country. We convert, we're 25th in the country. We convert 53% of our third downs either on third or fourth down. And then the last one we looked at is how often do we go for it relative to all of our fourth downs? We've gone for it on 28% of the time. So we punt 72% of the time. We go for it 28% of the time. That ranks 28th in the country. So you look at all those different ways, like how aggressive are we at going for it? How successful are we at going for it? How successful are we at, getting it when you also factor in our third down play calling? Top 25, top 30. And I think that's a really great place to be. We're not number one, but like you look at the teams that are number one, it's not, it's not Texas and Bama. It's a bunch of different ways to get there. And so I think it really shows that it's been a big part of our success this year and is clearly a place where we're looking at the stat sheet and saying, all right, guys upstairs, it's 4th and 4x yard line. Like what's the data tell us? And it's a data-driven process right now. And it's making us one of the better teams at this in the country.
Yeah, Brett, totally agree. I think it's when you have an offense that's able to convert these situations at a high clip, and then you also have a really strong defense, as we're going to get into a little bit more here, that just makes these situations a lot easier to pull the trigger on, and the analytics will tell you to go for it more. So we're going to get into now why, specifically from an analytics standpoint, why going for it on fourth is so important. And this is actually going to serve as a bit of a tutorial in terms of how the analytics break down and what are the key components that drive the decision whether to go for it or not. So if we wanted to do an absolutely perfect analysis and we could just get whatever data points that we wanted, we would get specifically what the fourth down conversion rate based on yards to go is. That would be one key component.
So like fourth and 1, 4th and 2, 4th and 3 versus just all fourth downs.
Yep. And the data nerds on NFL teams, like they have this data. Brett and I, a lot of this data is not as easy to get. The second component would be points added on average after successfully converting fourth down based on field position. So if you actually convert a fourth down from a certain field position, how many points are you typically getting when you do so? How many points are you actually adding in that scenario? And then finally, the last key component is how many points on average you're allowing, how many points your defense is allowing when you don't get that conversion. And the opposing offense starts at a certain field position. So it's like, if you don't get it, how many points are you potentially allowing?
Yeah. So, and just to break that down for 1 second too, it's to make sure that when you're looking at the data, should you go for it on 4th and 1 versus 4th and 4? Clearly more likely to go for it on 4th and 1. Should you go for it when you're at midfield versus your 35-yard line, 65 yards from the end zone, or the opposing team's 35-yard line, 35 yards from the end zone? We don't have that perfect data to break it down in those chunks. So you'll hear us talk about it more in averages. It's that field position that's not in a lot of the data we looked at, but we were able to tease out some of it.
Yeah, exactly. It's the specificity is what we don't have. So we don't have at this exact yard line, this is what it is. But we were able to find some good proxies for the data that I think give us some pretty good insight. So getting into that more, we looked at average points allowed by a defense once the defense has a scoring opportunity. So this is just like a big general average stat. collegefootballdata.com, they track this as when an offense gets to the opposing 40-yard line. So if you get to the opposing 40-yard line, that counts as a scoring opportunity. And then the other piece of data was average scoring on all drives. So that's based on an average starting field position of the offense on their own 30-yard line. So you have 70 yards to go. So we use these to kind of tease out some insights. So I guess let's get into that a little bit more. Let's start with, let's say you fail. Let's say the average fourth down attempt is around midfield. Sometimes it's in field goal range. Sometimes it's at the opposite 40, but let's say it's around midfield. So if you punt, the average field position for the opposing offense is going to be the 15-yard line. The math actually shows here that the difference in giving the other team the ball at the 15-yard line versus midfield around the 50, it's not as significant as maybe you would think. It's really, I would say, not that significant at all. Either, not that there's no difference, but not as major a swing as you would expect. Either way, they have the ball, and either way, they need to put a drive together. If you punt, you get 0 points. So there's no expected points if you punt. And if you convert, then you have first down in a good field position. And based on where you were attempting this, likely you're probably pretty close to a scoring opportunity. So you have a chance to score points. So average field position, as I mentioned, is about the opposing 30-yard line. So 70 yards to go. The average points per drive is 2.2. So if you just look at every average drive throughout the season, it's about 2.2. So, and that's assuming the opposing 30-yard line. The next thing you got to look at here is scoring opportunities. So when a team gets inside, as I mentioned, the opposing 40-yard line, what's key here is how much does that increase? So we mentioned 2.2 is average. How much does that actually increase when you get into the opposing, or when you get into a scoring opportunity? And so interestingly, that jumps up to about 3.9. So that extra 30 yards from starting at your own 30 to getting to the opposing 40, that's worth about 1.7 points. So I think these are, if we're framing up like from a field position standpoint, based on the data points we have, those are kind of like our key parameters here to keep in mind, is how many points you gain from getting into scoring opportunity, how many points you're expected to get on average from a normal drive. But yeah, Brett, I'll let you jump into some of these some of these data points a bit more.
Yeah, so if you're at the 30-yard line to start a drive and you score 2.2 points and you move into a scoring opportunity. So you move the ball 30 yards and you get to the opposing team's 40-yard line. So you've gotten halfway there. Your expected points goes from 2.2 to 3.9. So you get a 1.7 jump. Why are we saying that? That's about what you would gain by punting. You would be moving the team back by 40 yards. Say if you're at midfield and you're punting, it averages the 15. Sometimes you pin them in the 10. Sometimes it's a touchback to the 20. It kind of blends to the 15-yard line. So you're moving the opposing team back 40 yards to take over the ball if you would punt versus go for it on fourth down and be unsuccessful. You can attribute about 1.7 points to the other team. So if you punt versus unsuccessful, you are putting them 1.7 points in a better spot. But if you convert, well, you're a 1st and 10 around that scoring opportunity market, right? Like if you get a fourth down conversion and you're going for it in the middle of the field, you're at about that scoring opportunity range where you now go and get 3.9 points. So when you're successful on fourth down, you get 3.9 points. When you are unsuccessful, the trade-off versus punting is 1.7. You get a 2.2 points advantage by going for it on fourth down if succeeding was a 50-50, right? So if it was a 50% of the time you succeed, 50% of the time you fail, you should always want to go for it if you're using the numbers we're talking about, because when you're right, you get 3.9 points, and when you're wrong, you give up 1.7 points. That's a good coin flip. That's like hey, if I flip a coin and I'm right, I get $2, and if I'm wrong, you get $1. Will you make that bet with me in infinity? Like, absolutely, that's a good bet to do. And by the way, what do we know about fourth downs? Teams are successful about 50 to 55% of the time. It's a little better than a coin flip, but it's a good trade, especially when we're talking about that. Really, whenever we're talking about a fourth down that you think is a 50% conversion. In fact, you would take that so far as to say, even if you were successful about 35 to 40% of the time, it's a good trade. So when Notre Dame's successful 73% of the time, that's just gravy, right? Like that's just gravy on top. But what that really shows is college football teams and in the NFL should actually be going for it more often until you see a fourth down success rate around 40%. Then you'd say, hey, we've hit break even. Now, clearly, flow of the game matters. Are you down by a lot? Are you up by a lot? Like, different circumstance matters. And I'm not proposing going for it in your own end zone. But increasingly, we're even seeing teams say, at our own 35, at our own 40, where it might even be a bigger field position flip. It might be handing them the ball in a scoring opportunity. You're starting to see teams get even more aggressive in those data points because the benefit of succeeding is up almost two times, not quite two times, but it's about 70, 80% more expected benefit from being successful than what you give up to the other team by being unsuccessful. And so, Mike, I know we said that this wasn't maybe the most perfect data. I just simplified it. I know our buddy Jim hates when we use the finance isms on this. I feel like I just did back of the envelope math by just looking at, expected points if you're at the 40 versus expected points at the opposing 30. Like, we kind of simplified it. So where in there do you think you could maybe poke holes in our math, or where the oversimplifying might help or hurt that takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just. I mean, you hinted at some of this. I think it's situational, right? So I think, for instance, if you have a really poor defense, right, odds are you're probably going to be giving up more points in these scenarios where you don't convert. So that's something that you got to consider. And then, if your offense is also just not as good at converting, right? If you're bad at converting in these situations, then your offense as a whole is also worse. It's like, one, you're going to be less likely to convert, and then two, even if you do convert, it's less likely you're actually going to be able to get some incremental points out of it. So that's another factor to consider. And then I think, like other caveats that we mentioned, we don't have like the very specific data, so we can't say, all right, right, like obviously if it's like fourth and five, right, that's different than fourth and one. So it's kind of like, I would say these details are really where it makes a difference. Momentum is another factor, right? If you've just yeah, I look, the Texas A&M game. That's a recent example. Like, Texas A&M was going for it on fourth a couple times that game, and they got stuffed each time. And then I think it was like the third or fourth time, Elko didn't go for it because they just couldn't get any push at all. So if there's stuff like that that's happening, that's where it can kind of like change the decision on this a little bit. But I think, Brett, as you mentioned, the key thing here is we're using aggregate stats. We're using big averages to just kind of explain the general rationale for why this makes sense. So I think from my perspective, like when you look at it on average, it makes sense on average to be going for this. And teams that, I think don't fall into these weird kind of outliers that I was mentioning. I think this generally makes sense for them in most situations.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that always stands out is when coaches start saying, well, gut feel, or, emotion of the game, or how I was reading the flow, or, I just wasn't sure we had the right play call, or whatever else to make these decisions. You could have the worst offense in the world. And if you finally got to the 40-yard line, that might be your only chance to score. Like, this is actually the James Franklin problem at Penn State, where he'll get super conservative when he has a bad offense because he's like, man, I just don't know if they can convert. Well, guess what? You might not get back there. Like, this might be your only shot at points. And when you got that shot, you got to go take it. And so this is an area where, I think a lot of coaches still try to put the coach speak spin on it versus trusting the data. And you can't always go with the data, but if you're James Franklin and you're consistently like just going against it, it's like, oh, all right, that might explain why you're losing a lot of big games. There's even another scenario that we haven't looked at, but whether or not to go for it when you're in field goal range is a really interesting question. And even in the red zone, I think is when it's actually most obvious to keep going for touchdowns, because if if you're successful, you get 7 points. If you're unsuccessful, you get 0. And alternatively, you could have taken 3. So even if it's a 50-50 play, would you not just want the certainty of 3 points rather than the 50-50 of 3.5, the average of 0 and 7? But what I always like to focus on is, sure, but if you're unsuccessful, you also leave them pinned deep. And that's not a massive change. But if you can leave them pinned inside the 10 versus on a kickoff, they're going to average the 25 to 30. You also are giving your defense kind of an added benefit in the event you don't get it. And I just think teams still way too often are settling for field goals on 4th and 5. And I think if you're ever inside of 4th and 5 in field goal range, especially with college kickers that aren't quite as automatic, it's not like the average is 3. Like, if you're only making 75% of your kicks, the average is more like 2.5. Like, go for it in those 4th and manageable situations. And you can see all of these numbers. So again, we're talking in averages where going for it has about a 70 to 80% benefit if you're 50-50 going for it on fourth down. It's played out pretty darn accurately that way for Notre Dame's season. And maybe not exactly how you'd expect it to, but on the season, we're 11 for 15. So first caveat, sample size. We're talking about 15 data points. We're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of data points across every game and every team and every season. But if you break down, Notre Dame has had 15 attempts. They've converted 11 of them. And after those conversions have gone on to score 45 points. So about 3 points per attempt. Interestingly, that's pretty darn low to only be scoring 3 points after a fourth down conversion when it's usually around, 40-yard line or better, midfield or better. As a comparison, I was watching the Ohio State game this week. Before the Penn State game, they had scored a touchdown after every single successful fourth down this year. So that's awesome. Like if you're Ohio State, great. But ND is actually statistically not even taking advantage of going for it on fourth down as best as we could when we're successful. We still wind up, punting after that or having a turnover, missing a field goal, or for whatever reason, we're not taking advantage of it. Interestingly, though, our defense, after any drive, we are averaging about 1 to 1.5 points per drive. When you break it down to fourth down attempts, on the drives where we are successful, we then, kick off and the other team starts at about their own 30, 35-yard line. So they have about 65 yards to go on average. And we've allowed 16 points on those drives, or about 1.1 points per drive. When we are unsuccessful, so on those 4 fourth down attempts that we didn't convert, we've then only allowed 6 points on those ensuing drives. We've only given up 2 field goals, or about 1.5 points, despite the average field position being at about 55 yards to go. So, right around the 45-yard line near midfield. So our defense on the unsuccessful attempts is only giving up 0.4 more points per attempt. Our offense is gaining 3. That's a great trade for Notre Dame, that when we go for it, we're getting 3. And when we're unsuccessful, we're only giving up 0.4. That's a great trade that really tells you, should Notre Dame be doing this more often? Is really the question to be asking, because it's been highly successful at generating points without really much repercussion about giving up more points on the other side.
Yeah, Brett, I think that's some important points to mention is, could we be utilizing this more? And I think Freeman's been leaning into this much more than he has in the past, which again speaks to his development as a coach. But we actually did go through every drive to see if there were opportunities that we missed, ones where we should have gone for it on fourth. And there were. And unfortunately, there were a few that stood out, some that hurt in particular. So one in the NIU game, this was earlier in the NIU game. At the time, I believe the game was either tied or a 1-point game, but we punted on 4th and 4 at the 47-yard line. So this is a scenario that analytically, we definitely should have went for it. We didn't, and obviously we ended up losing the NIU game. If we'd gone for it, who knows? This could have been a play that may have given us enough to actually win that game. And then I think a couple others to call out are Louisville. There were 2 4th and 4. We had a 4th and 4 and a 4th and 5, and these were midfield. And then we had a 4th and 4 at the 30. So these are scenarios that are, from an analytics standpoint, would have made a lot of sense to go for it. We didn't. Obviously, Louisville, we won that game, but this is something that could have given us even more cushion. And then Georgia Tech, we had a 4th and 2 at the 63 yards to go. So it was at our own 37-yard line with 63 yards to go. We had a 4th and 2. And I get this is another one where I think coaches are probably a bit more hesitant to go for it from that deep in their own territory. But the analytics say that you should go for that. And based on how our team has performed this year, this is a scenario where we should have gone for it. You'd feel a little uneasy about going for it, but I think it's like once you get comfortable with the analytics, this is one where you should go for it. So, and I think just hammering home another point that Brett and I keep making here is that we were talking, we're using general stats to explain the rationale for going for it and how you should. But then when we got into these Notre Dame specific statistics, this shows that, it's a little bit different. Like, look, our offense doesn't convert quite as well as maybe the average does, but then our defense is a lot better. But even when you adjust those, it still definitely makes sense to go for it in these scenarios. So I think going through, yeah, there are a few opportunities where we could have gone for it on fourth that we missed out on. It's an area that we're getting better in, and I guess it's just kind of going through this. It's an area that we could still improve on a bit. It's an area where we could get a little bit more comfortable, and ideally, we get to a point to where we don't really have any of these situations that we're calling out where we should have gone for it and we didn't.
Yeah, and some of these, we've cited five. It's not like this is happening multiple times a game. On the most obvious situations, Notre Dame's going for it. In fact, I think only one of our fourth down attempts all year was on more than 4th and 4. So it's kind of 4th and 4 or less appears to be the cutoff. We went for it on 4th and 7 at Navy, which would have been a really long field goal, and Mitch Jeter was out. I think that's maybe factored into some of these too.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit longer, but also you're at your own 37 versus, in the Georgia Tech game, no, I guess I'm getting those games confused, but being at your own 37 versus being at the other team's 37 as an example makes a difference. So those all play in of like, what's the obvious go for it decisions versus the fringe cases. It feels like we've probably left 4 or 5 out on the field. And if all of those add a point and a half expected, like, sure, that could go against you, right? These are more binary outcomes. They lead to outcomes of 0, 3, and 7 in football, right? That they don't get into averages, but you've got to play them when you get into your, into your data, because you only get the ball so many times. So if you only get 10 drives in a game and you can add a point and a half a drive in a couple of key spots, that's how you're going to win over the course of a season and over the course of seasons, plural. Great seeing Freeman move in that direction. Frankly, great to see college football move in that direction. This is clearly becoming more prolific across the sport using the data. It's a little bit of the, sabermetrics in baseball starting to take hold in football of like, don't bunt, just stop bunting. Don't give up those precious outs. And it's like, don't punt. Like punting and bunting are both, the data is trying to say take those out of the sports of baseball and football, respectively. Feels like Freeman is leading that. Not the most aggressive, not the craziest out there. Maybe not Campbell and the Detroit Lions, but moving in that direction. So with that, hopefully there's more fourth down conversions and kind of big pressure moments for us here down the stretch. Hopefully those are more in the playoffs and we have an easier 3 or 4 weeks to get there. But until next time, Irish beat Seminoles.
Irish beat Seminoles.